kind of spirit than to be in the best place to be, a graveyard in the fall. This is a special place that I like to spend time. It might sound odd. I'm sure it does sound odd. And I brought with me today, just in case any spirits want to talk to us today. Oh my god, that scared me. I have my Ovilus with me, and it's sitting on my dash, and it just said Lash. In case any spirits want to talk, I have my Ovilus, and I also have my REM pod, so if there is anything here today, it can touch the REM pod, and that will cause the REM pod to light up. Hello everyone, thank you for allowing me to come in today, and I'm going to read you a scary story. And this story is called Pig Thing, and from the reviews I heard it's a little creepy. So, do you like my little microphone? I feel like an action news person. Alright, here we go. The end of light seemed to rise from the land rather than descend from the sinking sun, and a darkness that they seemed to feel upon their skin entered the bungalow. Day's end came with its own taste and smell too. Was peaty and dewy with sodden ferns, and seeped inside to make the air as damp as the garden's black earth. The skeletal branches of the mighty corrie trees surrounding the bungalow vanished into the void of the moonless country night, and made the children feel a strange dread that was much older than they were. Had they still been living in England, this would have been an evening when bonfires were lit, and to the three children, although these nights were frightening, they had a tinge of enchantment too, and were never as unsettling when their parents were inside the house. But tonight, neither their mother nor their father had returned from the rear garden that was enclosed by a vast wilderness of bush, ever intent on reclaiming their home, or so it seemed. Whenever the sun shone after the heavy showers of rain and made their world sparkle, their dad often remarked that he could hear the plants growing. Dad had ventured out first to try and get the car started in a hurry. Shortly after 9 o'clock, 20 minutes later, her face long with worry, Mom had gone outside to find him, and they had not heard from her since either. Before their mom and dad had left the house, the three children remembered seeing these same expressions of concern on their parents' faces when Mom's younger sister caught cancer and when Dad's work closed down. That wasn't long before the family traveled to New Zealand in the big ship for a fresh start on the day after the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Tonight, their parents had done their best to hide their anxiety, but the two brothers, Jack, who is 9, and Hector, who is 10, knew that the family was in trouble. Together with Lozzie, their 4-year-old sister, Jack and Hector sat in the laundry room of the bungalow with the door shut, where Mom had told them to stay before she went outside to find their father. Jack and Lozzie sat with their backs against the freezer. Hector sat closest to the door by the bottles and buckets that Dad had used for making wine, and they had been in the laundry for so long now that they could no longer smell the detergent and cloves. Only Lozzie's eyes existed in an assurance that the situation might become an adventure with a happy ending. They were large brown eyes, too, and prone to awe when she was told a story. And these eyes now searched Jack's face, sandwiched between his sister's vulnerability and the innocence that he recognized in himself, and his brother's courage that he admired and tried to copy. Jack's task was to stop Lozzie crying. "What you reckon, Hector?" Jack said as he peered at his brother while trying to stop the quiver in his bottom lip. Hector's face was white. "We were told to stay here. They're coming back." Both Jack and Lozzie felt better for hearing Hector say that, although the younger brother suspected that his elder sibling would always refuse to believe that their mom and dad were not coming back. Like Dad, Hector could deny things. Jack was more like his mom, and by making their voices go soft, he and his mother could sometimes get Dad and Hector to listen to their ideas. But no matter how determined anyone's voice had been earlier that evening, their dad had not been persuaded to stay inside the house. He had always rubbished their stories about the bush not being right, about there being something living inside it, about them seeing something peer in through the windows of the two end bedrooms of the bungalow that overlooked the garden and deserted chicken coop. When their dog, Schnapps, disappeared, their dad had said they were all soft and needed to acclimatize to the new country. And even when all the chickens vanished one night and only a few feathered and a single yellow foot were left behind, he still didn't believe his children about the bush not being safe. But he took them seriously that night because he had seen it too. Tonight, the whole family had seen it together. For months now, the children had been calling the intruder the pig thing. That was Lozzie's name for the face at the windows. She'd seen the pig thing first when she had been playing with Schnapps at the bottom of the garden, amongst the dank shadows where the orchard stopped and the wall of silver ferns and flax began. Pig Thing had suddenly reared up between the dinosaur legs of two curry trees, and never had their mother heard Lozzie make such a fuss. "Oh, Jesus, Bill, I thought she was being murdered," she had said to their dad once. Lozzie had been taken inside the house and quieted. Up on the hill east of the bungalow, even the boys who were putting a better roof on their den had heard their sister's cries. Frantic with excitement and fear, they had run home, each carrying a spear made from bamboo beanpole. And that was the day the idea of Pig Thing established itself more formally in their lives. But Pig Thing had returned and was no longer a children's story. That evening had played host to Pig Thing's worst visit because earlier that evening, as they had all sat in the lounge watching television, Pig Thing had come up and onto the sun deck and had stood by the barbecue filled with rainwater to look through the glass of the sliding doors, like it was no longer afraid of their dad. The pig thing had come out of the darkness beyond their bright windows and reared onto its hind legs to display itself like an angry bear, before dropping to all four trotters and moving back into the shadows of the ponga trees at the side of their property. Pig Thing could not have been visible for more than a few seconds, but the power in the thin limbs and the human intelligence in the eyes had frightened Jack far more than the large longfin eel that had once swum over his boot in the creek. "Don't. Oh, Bill, don't. Let's go together, Bill, with the torch," their mom had said to their dad once he said he was going out to get the car started. They were so far from Auckland, and had either of the police officers based at the near station been available that evening, it would have taken them over an hour to reach the bungalow. Their dad had told their mother what the police operator had told him after he called the police and reported an intruder, some kind of large animal or something, that was trying to get into their house. He couldn't bring himself to say Pig Thing to the operator, though that's what it had been. Lozzie had described it perfectly. Maybe it took a 4-year-old to see it properly. Pig Thing wasn't quite an animal and was certainly not human, but it seemed to have the most dangerous qualities of each when it had risen out of the darkness, bumped the glass, and then vanished. The 2 police officers had been called away to a big fight between rival chapters of bikers on the distant outskirts of the city. And with Pig Thing so close and perhaps eager to get inside the bungalow, waiting for help to arrive was not an option that their father even entertained. Their nearest neighbors, the Pitchfords, lived on their farm 2 miles away and had not answered their phone when the children's dad had called them. They were old, too. They had lived in the National Reserve since they were both children, and had spent the best part of 7 decades within the vast, cool depths of the bush, before much of the area was cleared for the new migrants. Mr. Pitchford still owned hunting rifles that were as old as the Great War. He'd once shown the guns to Jack and Hector and let them hold the heavy and cumbersome weapons that stank of oil. After the children's father had ended his phone calls, he and their mother had exchanged a look that communicated to Jack a suspicion that the Pig Thing might have already visited their neighbors that night. Going cold and shuddery, Jack believed that he had been close to fainting with fear, and all that repeated inside his mind was the vision of the creature's long torso pressed against the window, so that its brown teats inside the black dog belly hair had squished like a baby's fingers on the surface of the glass. Pig Thing's trottery hands had merely touched the pane, but that had been sufficient to make the glass shake in the front door frame. There was nothing inside the house, not a door or piece of furniture that could be used as a barricade, and their dad knew it, and Jack had imagined the splintering of the wood and the shattering of glass followed by his sister's whimpers, his dad shouting and his mom's screams as Pig Thing came grunting with hunger and squealing with excitement into their home. He had groaned to himself and kept his eyes shut for a while after the form had disappeared into the lightless trees corralling the sun deck, had tried to banish the images of that snouty face and the thin, grillish hair that fell about its leathery shoulders. And their mother had said, "Bill, please, don't go outside." The children had guessed that their mom had put her hands on their dad's elbows as she said this. They didn't see her do it, because by that time they had been herded into the laundry room where they had stayed ever since, but they had known by the tone of her voice that she had touched Dad's arm. "Shh, Jan, just shh now. Stay with the kids," their dad had said to their mom. He'd gone outside, but no one had heard the car engine start. The Morris Marina was parked at the bottom of the drive under the wattle tree where Hector had once found a funny-looking bone that might have come from a cow skeleton. Inside the laundry, the children had all huddled together and silently strained their ears and prayed for the sound of the car engine. But they were left disappointed, and since he'd gone for the car, they had heard nothing more from Dad at all. The new and sudden gravity introduced into their evening had increased with every passing minute, as stillness inside the house and a heaviness that made them all aware of the ticking of the clock in the hall. It was the very thickening of suspense around their bodies. Their mother had eventually opened the laundry door to report to the kids. She was trying to smile, but her lips were too tight. On her cheeks were the red lines made by her fingers where she held her face in her hands, something she did that at night, sitting alone at the kitchen table. She did it a lot when Dad was looking out for schnapps day after day. And Mom had never liked the new house or the surrounding countryside. She didn't like the whistles and the shrieks of the birds, or the yelps in the night that sounded like frightened children, or the animal tracks in the soil beneath her washing line that spun around the fierce winds, or the fat, long eel they had seen by the creek with a lamb gripped between its jaws, or the large, sticky red flowers that nodded at you as you walked past, or the missing dog, or the stolen chickens. Their mother didn't like any of it, and she said that she doubted she would ever become a Kiwi. She'd moved to this place for their dad. Hector and Jack knew that. And now she was missing too. Holding Lozzie's Wonder Woman torch because their dad had taken the big rubber flashlight from the kitchen drawer where the matches were kept, they had heard their mother calling, "Bill! Bill! Bill!" and trying to smother the tremble in her voice as she went out the front door and then walked past the side of the house towards the car. Her voice had gone faint and then stopped. It just stopped. And the fact that both of their parents had vanished without a fuss, no shout or cry or scuffle had been heard, had made the two boys hopeful that their mom and dad would soon come back inside. But as the silence lengthened, their heads had become busy with some dreadful ideas, including one that suggested that whatever had taken their parents had been so quick and so silent that they'd never had a chance to escape. Not a hope out there in the dark with it. Lozzie had sobbed herself into a weary silence after seeing the pig thing on the sun deck, and had begun whimpering after her mother's departure. For the moment, she had been placated by each of her brother's reassurances, lies, and brave faces. But her silence would not last for long. Lozzie stood up. She was wearing pajamas. They were yellow and had pictures of Piglet and Winnie the Pooh printed on the cotton. Her hair was tousled and her feet were grubby with dust. Her slippers were still in the lounge. Mom had taken them off earlier to remove a splinter from her foot with the tweezers from the sewing box. Although the soles of the children's feet were getting harder from running around barefoot all day outside, they still picked up prickles from the lawn and splinters from the sun deck. "Where's Mummy, boys?" Immediately, Jack patted the floor next to him. "Shh, Lozzie, come and sit down." Frowning, she pushed her stomach out. "No! I'll get you a tip-top from the freezer." Lozzie sat down. The freezer hummed, and its lemon glow emitted a vague sense of comfort and familiarity when Jack raised the cabinet lid. Hector approved of the ice cream trick, and after a deep breath, he returned to stare to the laundry door. He sat with his chin resting on his knee, both hands gripping the ankle of that leg, listening. Committed of face, Lozzie tucked... It just said portal. Are we at a portal? Are we opening a portal? Committed of face, Lozzie tucked into the cone loaded with Neapolitan ice cream. Jack shuffled to sit next to Hector. "What you reckon?" He used the same tone of voice before he and his brother crossed a waterfall in the creek or explored the dark, reeking caves up in the hills that Mr. Pitchford had told them to steer clear of, lads, or shined across a tree fallen over a deep gorge in the steamy tropical bush surrounding their house. The forest stretched all the way back to crazy beaches of black volcanic sand where the blowholes and riptides prevented them from swimming. Hector was the eldest and in charge, but he had no answers for his brother about what to do. But he was thinking hard. His eyes were a bit wild and watery, too, so Jack knew his brother was about to do something, and that frightened him. Already he imagined himself holding Lozzie when there were only two of them left inside the laundry room. "I'm gonna run to the Pitchfords," Hector said. "But it's dark." "I know the way." "But..." They looked at each other, and each of them swallowed, even though Jack hadn't mentioned the pig thing. They had thought of it at the same time. Hector stood up, but he looked smaller than he usually did. Appearing between his knees, Jack kept his face lowered until the creases disappeared from the sides of his mouth and from around his eyes. He couldn't let Lozzie see him cry. Before his brother left the laundry room, and then the house too, Jack had longed to hold him for a while, but couldn't do it. And Hector wouldn't have wanted that anyway, because it would have made his leaving even harder. Instead, Jack just stared at his own flat toes spread out on the lino. "Where's Hector going?" Lozzie asked, as a bubble popped on her shiny lips. "To get the Pitchfords. They have a cat," she said. Jack nodded. "That's right." But Jack knew that Hector would have to go first before he had even got close to the Pitchfords' place. Hector was going into the forest with the clacking branches and ocean sounds, and along the earthen paths and over slippery tree roots exposed like bones. These places that they had run and mapped together, and Hector would leap across the thin creek with the rowing boat smells, race across the fields of long grass that was darker than the English grass and had always felt wet, and where they had found 2 whole sheep skeletons and brought them home in a wheelbarrow to reassemble on the front lawn. Hector was going to run a long way through the lightless night until he reached the Pitchfords' house with the high fence and the horseshoes fixed around the gate. "To keep things out," Miss Pitchford had once told them in a quiet voice when Hector asked why they were nailed to the dark planks. "No, don't, no," Jack had whispered, unable to hold back when Hector turned the door handle. Everything had slowed, thick and cold, inside Jack's chest. Welling up in the back of his throat, this feeling spilled inside his mouth, tasting of rain. Inside Jack's head sang urgent, desperate sounds that were prayers trying to find words, and he squeezed his eyes shut to try and push the thoughts down, to squash them down, like he was forcing the lid back onto a tin of paint. He did everything that he could to stop the hysterics from storming out of his entire body. "Go to," Hector said, his eyes wild inside a still face. Lozzie stood up and tried to follow Hector. Jack snatched her hand, but gripped it too hard. She winced, tearing up, and stamped a foot. "Jack, don't open the door after I'm gone." They were Hector's final words. "Maze." It just said maze. Oh my god, I'm scared. It's so weird having this ghost thing on while reading a scary story, because maybe this kid's about to go into the darkness and get lost in a maze. Oh my god. "Jack, don't open the door after I'm gone." They were Hector's final words, and the laundry door clicked shut behind him. Jack heard his brother's feet patter across the floorboards of the hall, and the catch being turned on the front door. When that closed too, the wind chimes in the porch clinked and made an inappropriate spacey sound. There was a brief creak from the bottom steps of the porch stairs, and then Lozzie's sobs made an unwelcome return into the laundry room. After comforting her with a second ice cream cone, Jack unplugged the freezer. Quickly but carefully, so as to make less noise, he removed the rustling bags of frozen peas, the steaks, stewed apple, and fish fingers. He put the food in the big laundry sink that smelled like the back of Gran's house in England. Then he stacked the white baskets from inside the freezer against the side of the sink. Around the rim of the freezer cabinet, he placed plastic clothes pegs at intervals so that there would be a gap between the gray rubber seal of the freezer lid and the cabinet. Otherwise, they would run out of air when he shut them both inside the freezer. "Come on, Lozzie," he said, hearing some of his mom inside his voice, and he felt a bit better for doing something that wasn't just waiting. He picked up Lozzie and lowered her into the freezer, and together they spread Schnapp's old blanket over the wet floor of the cabinet so they wouldn't get cold feet and bottoms.
"This smells. His fur's on it. Look."
Lozzie held up a tuft of the brown fur that the dog used to get stuck between his claws after rifling his neck. Their mom and dad had been unable to throw the dog's blanket away in case Schnaps ever came home, so the blanket had stayed in the laundry where Schnaps had ended up sleeping at night. Their dad's idea of dogs sleeping outside had become a bad one after Schnaps had begun barking, whimpering, and finally scratching at the front door every night. "He's soft," their dad had said, but tonight their memories of Schnapp's distress had made a lot more sense. After handing the tub of ice cream and the box of cones to Lozzie, Jack climbed inside the freezer and sat behind his sister. He reached for his hand with her sticky fingers. She reached for his hand with her sticky fingers. As Jack pulled the lid down over their huddled bodies, he secretly hoped that the cold, wet freezer would stop the pig thing from smelling them. He also wondered if it stood upright on those hind, hairy back legs, as it had done on the sun deck, if those trotter things on the end of its front legs would be able to push the lid up. But he also took another small comfort into the dark with him. The pig thing had never come inside their house. Not yet, anyway. Miss Pitchford entered the bungalow through the empty aluminum frame of the sliding door. The glass had been smashed inward and had collected with the mess of the curtains that had been torn down during the forced entry. Miss Pitchford favored net curtains behind the windows of her own home. She didn't like the sense of exposure that the large windows gave the new homes, that the government had started delivering on truck beds for the migrants who were settling all over the area. She found it hard to even look at the red earth exposed beneath the felled trees. The appearance of these long, rectangular bungalows with thin cladding on their walls never failed to choke her with fury and grief that was no good for her heart. And who could now say what kind of eyes would have been drawn in these great glassy doors if you didn't use nets? You couldn't then go blaming them, who was already here. All of the lights were still on inside the bungalow. She looked at the brown carpets and the orange fabric on the furniture, and was startled again by what the English did with their homes. All formica and white plastic and patterned carpets and big garnished swirls and wallpaper and the color of coffee. Shiny, new, fragile, she didn't care for any of it. There was a television, too, and a new radio colored silver and black, and both made in Japan. They mesmerized her, the things these pale-skinned palms brought from faraway places and surrounded themselves with. But anyone could see that the palms and their things didn't sit right with the old bush. The bush had ways that not even the Maoris liked, but they were the things here before them, too. Glass crunched under her boots, and as Miss Pitchford made her way further inside the house, the kitchen and dining room were open plan, divided from the living room by the rear of the sofa. Unable to resist the lure of the kitchen, she went inside and touched the extractor fan above the stove. It was like a big hopper on a patrol lawnmower, and she marveled again at what young mothers considered necessary for the running of a household. And here was the food mixer Jan had once showed her, orange and white plastic with Kenwood Chevette printed along the side. A silver coffee pot with a wooden handle, what Jan had called a percolator, beside the casserole dishes with their orange flower patterns. Miss Pitchford ran her hard fingertips across the smooth sides of the Tupperware boxes that Jan had lined up on the counter. They were filled with cereal, rice, something called spaghetti, bran, and sugar. You could see the contents as murky shadows through the sides. Everything in her own home was wood, pottery, steel, or iron. And she remembered seeing the very same implements in use when she was a little girl, and had helped her mother prepare food. Hardwoods and metals lasted. Plastic and carpet and stereos hadn't been much use to this family tonight, had they? The sound of the car engine idling outside returned her sense of purpose. Harold had told her not to get distracted. She turned and waddled out of the kitchen, but her eyes were drawn to the sideboard beside the dining table, at all of the silver and ceramic trinkets behind the sliding glass doors, little sherry glasses, small mugs with ruddy faces on the front, china thimbles, teaspoons with patterns on the handles. There was a washing machine in the little laundry room beside the dining area, and a freezer, too. Jan had been horrified to learn that Miss Pitchford still washed clothes in a tin bath, used a larder for food, and still preserved fruit in jars. The bloody cheek. The laundry room smelled of wine, soap, powder, and urine. All of the food from the freezer was melting and softening inside the sink. The lid of the freezer was raised, and there was an old blanket inside the white metal cabinet that hummed softly. It was still cold inside the freezer when she leaned over to look inside, puzzled why the food was stacked in the sink. They had no mutton, no venison, no sweet potatoes that she could see. She looked under her foot and saw that she was standing on a yellow clothes peg. Inside the unlit hallway that led down to the 4 bedrooms, she paused for a few moments to get herself accustomed to the darkness. It was a relief to be out of the bright living area, but she would need more light to conduct a proper search in the bedrooms. Ordinarily, she could have found a sewing pin on the floor by the thinnest moonlight, because around here there were plenty who could see better at night than others. But tonight there was no moon, or starlight at all, and the curtains in the bedrooms were drawn, and it would be terrible if she missed something important. She found the light switch for the hallway. The family had no rugs. They had laid carpet all the way down the passage and even inside the bedrooms. How did Jan get the dust out of them, or air them in the spring like she did with her rugs? Shaking her head in disapproval, she went into the first room, Jan and Bill's room. 2 suitcases were open on the bed and had been filled with clothes. The headboard was softened with padded white plastic. Miss Pitchford reached out and pressed it. The next room for the little girl with all the lovely thick hair, dear little Charlotte. The light from the hall revealed the dim outlines of her dolls and toys, the books on all the shelves, and the bears in the wallpaper pattern. "Darlin'," she said quietly into the darkness. No one answered. Some of the teddy bears and stuffed rabbits were on the floor. They had been pulled off the shelves. Miss Pitchford had a hunch a few would be missing, too. She carried on, down the passageway to the 2 end bedrooms, Jack and Hector's rooms. Hector was safe at their home. How he managed to scuttle all the way to their farm in the dark had surprised her and her husband. But little Hector had come and banged on their door and then fallen inside, panting as pale as a sheet. She and Harold hadn't wasted a moment and had swept him into their arms, before spiriting him across the yard to Harold's workshop. "That kid was as slippery as an eel and quick as a fox," Harold had said, his eyes smiling after he returned to the kitchen from his workshop, and had removed his sheep shearing gloves and leather apron. He'd then yanked their coats off the pigs. "Come on, Mother, we better get our skates on." And when he'd arrived at their farm, Hector had been so concerned for his younger brother and sister that she and Harold had sped to the bungalow in the old black Rover that someone else had once brought over with them from England. Harold had taught himself to drive the car, too, not long after acquiring it from an elderly couple with those palmy accents that miss the H in every word. Harold would dress Hector when they returned with the other 2 children, if they were still around, though that seemed unlikely to Miss Pitchford. The family's bungalow was looking like it was completely deserted, like all of the bungalows on the Rangatira Road that were waiting for new palmy families or Pacific Islanders, or even more of those bloody Dutch duckies. That's a weird thing. Poles were supposed to be coming too. What next? The 2 end bedrooms were empty, but she smelled what all life leaves behind, and then found the spore on the floor of one of the boys' rooms that overlooked the wattle tree. It was ruddy in color and smelled strong, the fresh stool of excitement, the stool of too much fresh blood gulped down, but a very greedy girl. Kneeling down, Miss Pitchford tried to scoop it into her handkerchief, but there wasn't too much of it. She stripped a pillowcase off the bed. "You've been at it here, my little joker," Miss Pitchford said, with a rueful smile. Her errant daughter must have hunted right through the house until she'd found the other 2 kittywinks hiding. Under the beds, maybe? Or in that hardboard wardrobe with the sliding doors on the little plastic runners? What a rumble you've had, my girl. This kind of house couldn't have possibly made a family feel safe either. It was like cardboard covered in tin. But her daughter must have, at the very least, had the sense to take Jack and little Charlotte outside the house first, like Harold had shown her how to do with the other palms. Otherwise, they'd have to burn out another of these bungalows to incinerate the leavings, and that always made a flaming mess. "One more, and it'll smell funny," Harold had warned after the last bungalow that they'd lit up. Miss Pitchford went back to the laundry room and found a scrubbing brush, detergent, and a bucket. She filled the bucket with hot water from the tap in the laundry, and then went back to the boys' room and scrubbed the rest of the muck out of the carpet. While she was doing this, Harold had become impatient and had sounded the car horn. "Hold your bloody horses," she'd called out, but Harold couldn't have heard her. When Miss Pitchford was finally back inside the car and seated beside her husband with a pillowcase in her lap, the contents wet and heavy, with 3 Tupperware containers inside a brown paper bag clutched in her other hand, she asked Harold, "You want to check the creek?" "Nah, she'll be right, long gone. She'll be up in the caves by now, Mother." "She got carried away again, my love." Smiling with a father's pride, Harold said, "She's a big girl, Mother. You've got to let them suss their own way in this world. Be there for them from time to time, but still, we've done what we can for her. She has her own family now. She's just providing for them the best way she knows how." "We've been very lucky with her, Harold. To think of all them sheep that Len and Audrey lost last year with their girl." "You're not wrong, Mother, but when you let a child run that wild—" Harold rolled his eyes behind the thick lenses in the tortoise-shell frames of his glasses, which he'd taken off the old Moroi boy whom they'd found fishing too far downstream last summer. "It's all about pace, Mother. We showed our girl how to pace herself. A chook or 2, a dog, a cat. And if dags like these palms are still around after that, well, it comes down to who was here first. And who was here first, Mother?" We, dear, we was. And that's the story. So what was the pig thing? Their baby? I don't know how to feel after that one. So what do you think? It ate the little kids? It obviously ate the parents. Sorry, I'm getting so excited that I'm forgetting I should be a little more quiet. It ate the parents. It ate the kids. And it sounds like the parents killed the boy. What do you think? I'm going to link this book below if you guys want to buy it from Amazon. Got this from a book called Some Will Not Sleep. So if you want to read some of their other ones, should be pretty good. A little disturbing though, right? Welcome to Halloween. It's finally the official month, even though we've been getting ready for it since August. So enjoy yourselves. Have a wonderful day. Have a good night. Don't let the pig thing bite. See ya.